Picture this. It's May 1821, and you are standing inside Longwood House, a crumbling farmhouse perched on a barren volcanic plateau of St Helena, the loneliest prison on Earth. Outside, a harsh Atlantic wind howls against warped shutters, carrying a damp spray of salt that coats the walls with mildew. Inside, the air is thick with the twin smells of opium and sickness. The wooden floors creak, the plaster peels, and from somewhere inside the walls comes a faint scratching of rats. This is where the most feared man in Europe has been reduced to a ghost of himself. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the Emperor of France, the general who humbled kings and redrew the map of Europe, is now confined to a sagging bed in exile. Once adored by soldiers who marched across continents at his command, he lies bloated, broken, and barely able to lift his head. To outsiders, the story is simple. Napoleon has been safely caged by the British after Waterloo, slowly fading into history. A man who burned too brightly, now extinguished in peaceful obscurity. But reality tells a far darker tale. The truth is that his last days were not gentle decline, but a theater of paranoia, poison, betrayal, and human decay. The emperor's body has become his new battlefield. A raging fire consumes his stomach. His skin is yellowed, stretched tight over swelling limbs. His once penetrating gaze is clouded by pain. At night, his groans echo through the damp corridors. Attendants whisper that his very bones crack as he shifts in bed. The smell of infection clings to everything in the room, impossible to wash away. Every meal stirs suspicion. Each glass of wine is eyed with dread before he dares to drink. His closest companions debate whether he is dying of cancer or being slowly murdered by poison. Hidden in his bread, his wine is medicine. And surrounding this fragile body is an invisible net of surveillance. Governor Hudson Lowe's soldiers pace the courtyards outside. His letters are opened, his friends monitored. Even in this desolate exile, Napoleon knows there is no privacy. Every smile hides betrayal. Every servant might be a spy to the world. His exile is a symbol of restored order, proof that Europe has contained the French menace. But here, on this remote rock lashed by sea and storm, a darker drama unfolds. A great man rotting alive while enemies circle closer, waiting for death to finish the job. This isn't just history. This is human tragedy. A conqueror of continents, dismantled not by cannon fire or cavalry charges, but by time, treachery, and a failing body that became as much a prison as the Atlantic Sea around him. Just a few years before that damp bedchamber in Longwood House, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the summit of power. He crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame, commanded the loyalty of the Grande Armée, and by sheer will and brilliance forced monarchs across Europe to kneel. From Austerlitz to Jena, it seemed impossible that this once obscure Corsican officer could be beaten. But in 1815, on the muddy fields of Waterloo, the tide finally broke. Driven back by a coalition of Europe's great armies, Napoleon was forced to surrender. At first, he appealed to the British for asylum, hoping to live in quiet dignity, perhaps on an English estate. But Britain had no intention of letting the man who had nearly brought all of Europe to its knees live freely where admirers could visit him. Instead, they chose a prison no walls could breach, the remote Atlantic island of St Helena, more than 1,000 miles from any coast. Here, on this desolate volcanic rock, Napoleon was stripped of all but his memories. The man who once ruled millions now found himself surrounded by the sea, dependent on his jailers even for food. And overseeing this captivity was a man seemingly destined to clash with him, Sir Hudson Lowe, the island's governor. Lowe was neither a great soldier nor a visionary strategist. He was cautious, petty, and obsessed with preventing escape. To Napoleon, he was the incarnation of British small-minded tyranny, a bureaucrat playing jailer to a giant. Exile was not peace. It was a deliberate campaign of diminishment. Gone were the thrones, the armies, the glory. In their place came endless surveillance, hostile officials, and the slow grind of isolation. Napoleon's downfall was not a single battlefield defeat. It was to be a slow destruction, body, spirit, and legacy attacked in a cage of rock and ocean. By the spring of 1820, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer the tireless general who had marched his men across Europe. His body, once a weapon of endurance, had turned traitor. He complained of constant pain in his stomach, describing the agony as if razor blades were cutting him from within. Meals that once fed his legendary energy now left him nauseous. He vomited frequently, his body wasting as the pain grew sharper. He endured swelling in his abdomen, his legs heavy with fluid, his very frame betraying him step by step. His hair, once thick and dark, began to thin in uneven clumps. His skin turned a sickly yellow, stretched tight against swelling eyes and gaunt cheeks. Observers whispered about his jaundiced complexion, noting how it seemed to glow faintly in the candlelight, a face becoming wax even before death. It is these symptoms that would later ignite suspicions long after his death. Arsenic poisoning, administered slowly, hidden in his food, or even baked into the very wallpaper that lined his chambers. But others, looking at the record, suggest a more mundane yet equally dreadful fate. Stomach or gastric cancer, possibly inherited from his father. Either way, the result was the same, unrelenting torment. Daily life became a routine of endurance. Walking across a room was exhausting. On bad days, he struggled even to stand. Warm baths became his one reprieve, reducing the pressure in his abdomen, dulling the cutting sensation within. He would sit there for hours, attendants silently watching steam curl around the figure of the fallen emperor. A man who had shaken Europe, now reduced to soaking in tepid water for relief. Yet even in this broken state, Napoleon refused total surrender. Between bouts of sickness, he dictated his memoirs, his voice soft but still urgent as he rewrote the story of his empire for posterity. Pages filled with campaigns, victories, betrayals. Dictations captured by loyal followers who shaded candles against the drafty winds rattling Longwood House. When strength failed him, he whispered memories, clutching the portrait of his son, the King of Rome. This strange dual life marked his final year. By night, a man writhing in pain, haunted by the betrayals of his own body. By day, an emperor in exile battling time itself, racing against dissolution to leave behind the one thing Britain, lo, and disease could not strip from him, a legacy immortal on paper. If Napoleon's body was one prison, the other was a house and island built around him. Longwood was less a residence than a fortress of suffocation. Governor Hudson Lowe, determined that no miracle escape would ever replicate Elba, fashioned a system of restrictions so thorough it turned daily life into psychological torture. Armed guard patrolled every approach. Visitors from ships or the island itself were subject to Lowe's suffocating rules. Some were denied entirely, others forced into interviews under watchful eyes before they could say a word to the exiled emperor. Napoleon's correspondence was intercepted and censored. Letters to his family were delayed, redacted, or destroyed, leaving him isolated not only by sea but by silence. Pages that did leave the island often arrived full of blanks. Entire passages cut away by British administrators who feared his words could become weapons. Inside the shrinking world of Longwood, trust itself began to fray. Napoleon's household, once a small circle of loyal companions, withered under pressure. Friends became informants, their conversations whispered later to British officers. Servants were pressed into becoming the eyes and ears of Lowe's administration. Dinnertime laughter fell into suspicious pauses, as each man wondered what words might end up twisted in a governor's report. The exiled emperor increasingly moved as if he were surrounded by shadows. Even life's most basic acts carried the weight of paranoia. Napoleon refused to drink water unless he broke seals himself, suspicious that the very cups handed to him might carry death. Wine bottles already opened were set aside. He often switched plates suddenly at meals to keep those around him guessing. Britain had barred him from the continents of Europe, but within Longwood's thinning walls, he was caged by mistrust. Perhaps the cruelest irony was that Napoleon had once built his empire on information. Spies, intelligence, the surveillance of Europe's courts. Now he, too, lived under surveillance. The man who had watched the world became the world's prisoner, reduced to pacing within a cage of rock, sea, and the endless suspicion of Hudson Lowe. Death was inevitable. The question was how it was delivered. Almost from the moment Napoleon's last breath left him on May 5, 1821, suspicion began to swirl around the island like the unceasing Atlantic wind. Was the emperor felled by nature, cancer gnawing at his stomach, or was he murdered, undone by a carefully measured campaign of poison? Modern science would later reignite the debate. In the 1960s, samples of Napoleon's preserved hair were tested with neutron activation analysis and revealed arsenic levels far higher than normal. Later tests across multiple strands showed not a single lethal dose, but chronic exposure over months and years. The pattern suggested ingestion, not accident, coupled with contemporary accounts. Bottles of wine delivered with broken seals, flour with a bitter odor, and suspiciously spoiled casks of meat. The evidence pointed towards something darker than decay. Servants themselves sometimes reported mysterious bouts of illness while sharing meals, though rarely as severe as their master's suffering. The finger of blame often pointed to Count Charles de Montholon, one of Napoleon's closest companions. Montholon stayed even after his wife left the island, insinuating himself deeper into the ailing emperor's household. He managed the meals, controlled access, and curiously appeared unaffected by food that sickened others. Decades later, letters surfaced suggesting that his financial ties to the restored Bourbon monarchy, the very regime that benefited most from Napoleon's permanent removal. The possibility that a trusted confidant was also a paid instrument of murder remains one of the darkest accusations in the history of exile. But counterarguments persist. St Helena's environment was riddled with potential poisons of its own. The very wallpaper in Longwood House was dyed with cobalt green pigment, known to emit arsenic vapors in damp conditions. In the perpetual humidity, spores and mold interacted with the wallpaper, creating a toxic haze Napoleon could not escape. His medicines, too, were laced with compounds lethal by modern standards. Mercury, antimony, and calomel prescribed to soothe his pains may have hastened his decline. What appears to be poisoning, skeptics argue, may simply be the heavy hand of 19th century medicine colliding with fragile health. There is also the strong case for stomach cancer, an affliction from which Napoleon's father had died. The emperor's symptoms, excruciating abdominal pain, weight fluctuations, recurring vomiting, and eventual wasting, mirror the disease precisely. The autopsy performed after his death noted a massive ulcer and cancerous stomach tissue. Yet here, too, contradictions muddy the verdict. The disappearance of certain organs, discrepancies between French and British reports, and witness accounts that hint at evidence quietly brushed aside. For Napoleon himself, though, the academic debate was immaterial. Whether by cancer, poison, or both, he knew that death prowled ever closer. His food was suspicious, his medics uncertain, his body rebelling. Paranoia was not delusion, but survival instinct. He once told a confidant, "If I die here, it will not be from nature." And so the tension persisted. Was he condemned by hereditary disease, undone by the primitive medicine of his age, or assassinated by those who feared even a powerless emperor? The truth may never be fixed, but the uncertainty ensures that his final days remain not only a tragedy, but a mystery, one as compelling as any created on the battlefield. By April of 1821, the struggle was nearly over. Napoleon spent most days confined to his bed at Longwood House, drifting in and out of pain-racked delirium. His attendants described how he muttered fragments of old campaigns, reliving the thunder of cannon on forgotten battlefields. Sometimes he stretched out his arm, as though grasping reins, spurring on phantom cavalry. At night, the fevered dreams grew more intense. He would start awake, calling out for Josephine, the first wife he had divorced but never forgotten, whispering her name into the darkness as though she might walk through the door. Between these bouts of delirium, there were flashes of clarity. He summoned his secretaries to record final dictations, detailed notes on his campaigns, corrections to his memoirs, and most pointedly, accusations. He claimed the English oligarchy had sentenced him to death by poisoning, that he was being assassinated not by battle, but by grains of poison hidden in wine and bread. In his last will, he instructed his companions to preserve his story so the world would know he did not die naturally. Despite his collapse, there were still moments when the emperor reemerged. On April 15th, he summoned enough strength to dictate his political testament, leaving his sword and decorations to his son, the Duke of Reichstadt. "Let him never forget that he was born a French prince," Napoleon whispered, his voice breaking. To Bertrand, his most faithful friend, he pleaded that his son be told the truth, that his father died as a prisoner, betrayed and slowly murdered. His body, however, told a hopeless story. By the end of April, swelling had grotesquely distorted his stomach. while his limbs shrank into brittle sticks of bone. Doctors noted his tongue had blackened. His breath carried the stench of decay. His skin, waxen and stretched, glistened with an unhealthy sheen. His attendants could not mask their horror. The man who had once carried Europe on his shoulders was now hardly recognizable as human. On May 3rd, he rallied one last time. Opening his eyes, he recognized those around him, Bertrand, Montalin, Marchand, and murmured, "France, the army, head of the army, Josephine." They were fragmented words, but they carried every essence of his identity. The nation he built, the soldiers he loved, the woman he had lost. 2 days later, as the evening sun sank over the Atlantic, Napoleon's struggle ended. At 5:49 p.m. on May 5, 1821, his breathing stopped. Witnesses reported that in that final instant, the tension in his features eased, as though death itself was a relief after years of pain. In the dim light, his broken body rested silently, no longer emperor, no longer general. Simply a fragile man gasping his last in the Atlantic fog. Death did not put an end to controversies surrounding Napoleon. If anything, it deepened them. His body, lying still beneath the leaking roof of Longwood, was immediately the subject of intense scrutiny. On May 6th, an autopsy was carried out by his Corsican physician, Dr. Anna Markey, under the suspicious gaze of several British doctors. The official verdict chalked his death up to stomach cancer, the same disease that had killed his father. But discrepancies in those reports ignited suspicion. Some witnesses claimed his stomach showed signs of ulcers and tumors. Others insisted the evidence was inconsistent with cancer. Organs mentioned in early drafts of the autopsy mysteriously vanished from final versions. His heart, for instance, supposedly preserved, was never accounted for. French attendants quietly accused British observers of altering details to mask the real cause. Deliberate poisoning, slow and systematic. And then there was the corpse itself. When Napoleon's coffin was sealed, it was wrapped in layers of tin and mahogany, thought to contain the worst of decomposition. But legend quickly spread that his body was unnaturally well preserved, almost untouched by decay even as weeks became months. Later generations would seize on this as proof of arsenic exposure. The very poison suspected to have hastened his death is known to preserve human tissue. Macabre tales multiplied. During the long funeral procession to his first grave site on St Helena, some accounts claim the coffin leaked, and that stray dogs were seen licking the fluids of the emperor who had once commanded Europe. Whether fact or lurid invention, it contrasted starkly with his intended image, an emperor in defeat reduced to carrion fodder. But in 1840, nearly 20 years after his burial, Napoleon's remains were disinterred to be returned triumphantly to Paris. When the casket was opened, by all reports his body was astonishingly intact, as if the years had hardly touched him. Whatever the science, the spectacle was undeniable. Millions thronged Paris to watch the emperor's second funeral. In life he had been worshipped and reviled, conqueror and tyrant. In death, he remained a riddle, saint to some, monster to others, and still impossible to bury without controversy. Napoleon's last days on St Helena reveal truths that echo far beyond the Atlantic island where he died. They strip away the mythology of the emperor astride a white charger and remind us of the raw fragility that lies beneath all power. Conquerors may dictate treaties, crown themselves in cathedrals, and carve histories into the earth, but their bodies, like all bodies, are frail. In the end, this man who once outwitted coalitions of kings was reduced to bloated limbs, a failing stomach, and nights spent pacing between nightmares and baths. His exile also shows how political systems choose humiliation over simple dignity. Britain did not merely secure Napoleon on an island. It starved him of companionship, censored his words, and placed him under the petty surveillance of Hudson Lowe. Exile became less about justice than about spectacle, the careful, deliberate diminution of a giant, in that the paranoia of empires mirror Napoleon's own, each utterly convinced the other plotted in the shadows. And perhaps that is the most haunting legacy of St Helena. Rulers undone not by massed armies, but by whispers, betrayals, and the betrayals of their own bodies. Napoleon once ruled millions, yet in his final year he was imprisoned not only by the sea, but by a glass of wine he no longer trusted, by the ache in his bones, by the suspicion that every hand near his bedside might carry poison. The modern resonance is hard to ignore. Power does not always collapse in battle. It often withers in secrecy and sickness, behind closed doors. How many leaders since have been unmade as much by their own frailty and paranoia as by their enemies? Napoleon's death remains a riddle, a case study in the limits of power, and in how legends grow as bodies crumble. He who once strode across continents ended his life fighting invisible enemies, pain, poison, and time itself. His body failed, but his legend did not. And that may be why, 2 centuries later, we continue to argue over his final hour. Was he the victim of fate, or was he murdered